up till now, we talked only about the product market. So we looked at the market for final goods and services. And of course, we had the consumers being the demand side and firms representing the supply side. Now there are markets for the intermediate goods that are used to make things, and not only goods, but things like wages and labor. Labor is an input to production, and so there's a market for labor. Okay, so in terms of inputs to production, when we're thinking of this market, in the factor market, we have that firms represent the demand for the inputs, and households are the one that supply the factor of inputs. So we're just going to focus on labor, the market for labor, demand and supply of labor. So households supply labor to firms, and firms demand labor from households. And so we have a market there. So that's what we're going to focus on. The demand for labor curve, it's a demand curve, so it's going to show the relationship between the price and the quantity. But here, the price is going to be the price of labor, which is the wage, and then the quantity is going to represent the number of labor units. It could be number of workers or number of hours, depending on the context, okay? And we're going to assume that in the product market and in the labor market, we're going to assume that both of those markets are perfectly competitive. So that just means that we can assume that the firm will take the product price as given, and the firm will also take the wage as given, okay? They can't influence the wage. They're just a small player. Okay, so, and also the workers, no one has any big impact on the overall market, so they just take things as given. Now, one thing to point out is that the demand for labor is derived demand. And we're just saying that because it depends on the demand for the product. So if the demand for the product is higher, then obviously the firm will need more labor, and so the demand for labor will be higher. So how would a firm decide how much to hire? Well, by now you should think about, or you should realize, well, in economics, we're always thinking on the margin, and we would want to do some activity in general as long as the marginal benefit from that activity exceeds the marginal cost. So we want to do that activity up to the point where the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost. So in this context, the marginal benefit is going to be what you get from from hiring another unit of labor. So if you hire another unit of labor and they work, you're going to get your marginal product out of them, so some quantity, and then the benefit is what you can sell that at. Okay, so what we'll see is that's called marginal revenue product. So that's the marginal benefit of hiring someone, and we want to keep doing that until it equals the marginal cost. Well, here we're just going to assume that the wage is constant, and so the marginal cost in this analysis will just be the wage. Okay, so this slide here is just telling us about marginal revenue product. Okay, so marginal revenue product is the change in total revenue when you hire an additional unit of labor. Okay, and so what's that going to be comprised of? Well, it's going to be comprised of the marginal product, right, of the person you just hired times the price. So remember in an earlier lecture, we talked about marginal product. Marginal product is just the additional amount of output you would get from hiring an additional worker. And so here we're just basically multiplying that by the price. And we're able to just multiply by the price because we're just assuming the market price is constant. And marginal product can be rewritten as the change in quantity with respect to a change in labor. And so these things are equivalent. And then obviously the revenue, of course, is also equal to the change in quantity times the price. Okay, so that's marginal revenue product. It'll be a little clear when we go through an example. So we're going to derive the labor demand curve, but we need to know how to do that. So how does a firm decide how much labor to hire? Well, as I said, they're going to hire until the marginal revenue product of labor, which is the marginal benefit of hiring a worker, is equal to the wage, which is the marginal cost. So we're assuming competitive markets. So in this case, the firm will take the wages given, and it's just going to set that equal to the marginal revenue product of labor. Now, so that will be the optimality condition. So whatever the wage is, the firm is just going to set the wage equal to marginal revenue product of labor. This is, analogous to what we did with the individual firm in perfect competition. The individual firm takes the market price as given and sets that equal to their marginal cost. And remember, that traced out a supply curve. Well, here it's similar. It's a different story in the background, but here we're going to be tracing out a demand for labor curve by varying the wage. So we're just assuming the firm will take whatever wage is, it can, the market wage, it takes it as given, and it's going to hire up until the marginal revenue product of labor equals that. Can anyone tell me why we would expect this to be equal at some point? Why would so in order for this to be equal at some point, the marginal revenue product of labor would have to fall, right? Because we're assuming at some point it's going to be above the wage and then it's going to fall so that it becomes equal. What's that assumption we made? And what's that assumption that's relevant in the short run? We talked about this in the cost chapter. It starts with a D, diminishing something. Anyone? Yeah, that's exactly right. Diminishing returns, right? So marginal product will tend to fall in the short run because capital's fixed. Remember the pizza restaurant example? You only have so many ovens and a certain kitchen size. So if you keep hiring labor, there's going to be a point where the person, you hire another unit of labor and that person's going to produce less than the person before. Okay, so that's the idea. And so since marginal revenue product of labor is just the marginal product times the constant price, since marginal product falls, marginal revenue product of labor will fall. And as we'll look at it on a diagram momentarily, let's first look at some hypothetical data. So here we're given units of the resource. So we can just assume this is labor units. So 0 to 7. Okay, so we're told here that, for example, if we hire just one person, our total product will be 7. So then what's the marginal product of the first worker? Anyone? Yeah, well, it basically always takes effect here. So immediately, even after we've hired the first worker, after the first worker, we see like the marginal product's always declining here, okay? And so now we have the product price of the fourth column. And so to get the marginal revenue product, we'll talk about that in a sec. First, let's look at column 5. So column 5 is just the total revenue. So total revenue would just be equal to the total product. So column 2 multiplied by column 4. Right? So if we hire one worker, they're going to produce 7 units. We're going to get $14 for that, right? 7 units times 2. And so the total revenue is 14. And so then the marginal revenue product of that first worker is also 14. The marginal revenue product of the second worker is 12. Let's think about why. When we hire the second worker, we get a marginal product of 6. So that person produces 6 units. What's it worth? Well, each are worth $2. So 6 times 2 is 12. Okay, so this is the marginal revenue product. All we're doing is taking the marginal product and multiplying it by the price. That's another way to look at it as well. And so if we plot this, we will get this. And now we're saying this is the demand curve because the firm is simply going to take the wages given and set it equal to marginal revenue product. So if the wage is $10 in the market, the firm then will hire up to 3 workers. This is a little off here. It's looking at in between, so 0 to 1, 0. So we would think of it as hiring the third worker, right? If we hire the third worker, so the marginal product of the first worker is this, second, third. Okay, so the third worker, their marginal revenue product is 10. Right? And so if the wage is 10, we're only going to hire 3 workers. Okay, so this dot is associated with the third worker. Okay, does that make sense? So we just, as long as the benefit from hiring the worker is greater than the cost, which is the wage, we keep hiring. And so that's actually, the demand curve for labor because that's what it traces out. You can vary the wage and see what the firm would hire. That's the demand curve for labor. If obviously the marginal revenue product is greater than the wage, then the last worker is profitable and the firm should hire more. If its marginal revenue product is less than the wage, then the last worker was a loss and should not be hired. And so the optimal condition is where the marginal revenue product is equal to the wage. Yes, Manan, yeah. So here again, it's like in perfect competition in the product market, the firm takes the price as given and sets it equal to marginal cost. Here, the firm takes the wages given and sets it equal to the marginal revenue product of labor. That would be the optimal point, okay? And so the wage would be, you could be given the overall market demand and supply curve for labor. The intersection will determine the market wage, and then that's the wage each firm would take as given, okay? So usually we have, well, actually, let me ask you. So if our marginal revenue product, it looks like this, it increases here and then decreases. What's going on when this increases? What's happening to marginal product here? Here, we have diminishing returns take effect, and so marginal product starts to fall. And so then why is the demand curve for labor in the short run downward sloping? Well, it's because of our assumption of diminishing returns, okay? So anyways, that is the demand. So the demand curve for labor is only the downward sloping portion of the marginal revenue product. You wouldn't, if the wage was $15, you wouldn't hire just one worker, you would hire 8 workers, right? Because in all this region here, your marginal revenue product it exceeds your marginal cost, and so it's profitable to keep hiring up until this point, okay? So now let's talk about the supply of labor. So really the supply of labor comes from the labor force. And I'll just briefly cover something from another lecture notes just to give you a feel for the labor force. And so the labor force is arrived at first by looking at the total population and then taking things away. So let's do this right now we're going to find the labor force for Canada in 2015. So in 2015, the total population in Canada was 35.85 billion. Now we're going to remove essentially people who aren't legally able to work, which is children under age of 15. And so after we remove this group, there's some other categories here, but for the most part, it's just children under the age of 18. And so we call this section now, what's left over, the working age population. Now, this isn't the labor force yet, right? This is the working age population. We want to now exclude people who are not willing or able to work, okay? And so people who are not willing or able to work would include people who are retired, people who won the lottery or wealthy, they don't need to work, full-time students who should be dedicating all of their time to study so they get good marks and they don't mess up any future opportunities. If you don't get good marks, you don't know in a few years from now, you might decide you want to do graduate studies. And if you don't have the marks, you'll never be able to do it for the rest of your life. So that's just my little input there. You should be trying to get the highest marks as you possibly can. There's a British expression called penny wise, pound foolish. You don't want to be, but I understand some students have trouble. It can be difficult to make ends meet. Education aren't by working, making a few extra dollars, putting yourself in a position where you're lowering your opportunity future because your marks are really low. This also includes people who are discouraged, who just aren't bothering to look for work anymore. Maybe they're on social assistance or living at home in their parents' basement. And so someone who is disabled would also be in this category because they're not able to work. They may want to work, but they're not able to work. So then once we remove these people, so the labor force in Canada in 2015 was 19.28 million. Okay, and so this is where the supply of labor comes. This is also where all of the goods and services, this is the group that makes all of the goods and services in the country in a particular year. So this group here is responsible for the income of the country, right? And so that's the labor force. Now, the labor force can be made up of those who are employed and those who are unemployed. And to get the unemployment rate, we just take the number of people unemployed and divide it by the entire labor force. So it's the proportion of the labor force who are unemployed. In 2015, that was 6.9% Canada-wide. Now, the participation rate is the labor force as a proportion of the working age population. One of the main reasons why this has changed in the last decade or so is because we have the baby boomer generation who are reaching the retirement age. And so the participation rate is going to fall a bit because of that. So anyways, in 2015, it was 65.8%. Of course, we don't want this to be too low because this is our tax base. So if many of these people are on some type of they're getting transfer payments from the government, well, it could pose problems. So anyways, that's, just a little bit of a primer on the labor force. Now I'm going to go back to that other slide. Only people in the labor force are ones that are willing to work, right? So that's where the labor supply comes from. Okay, the labor force, like the supply curve for labor is simply going to be the relationship between wages and, say, hours worked, right? So if it's upward sloping, that means that the higher the wage, the more people would want to work. But it's not that simple. So the supply of labor, we generally think of it as upward sloping, right? So you can see this new slide, right, where I have the income effect and substitution effect here. Okay, good. So it's generally upward sloping, but it could possibly be negatively sloping at some point as well. So the reason is that when you have an increase in your wage, there's two effects, the income effect, and it would work to make you work less, right? So if you have a wage increase, you can now afford to buy more leisure in a sense, right? You just think about it. If your wage went up, if you could choose your hours, you could potentially just choose to work a bit less hours and get the same amount of money as before. And so some people, if, depending on the level of the wage, if that's what they desire, then there's an inverse relationship between the wage and hours worked, okay? But there's two effects going on though. So there's that effect, but at the same time, when the wage that you can get increases, the opportunity cost of not working is much higher. So the cost of leisure is much higher because you can get a higher wage. And so basically that's the substitution effect. You would want to work more because you're paid more. Okay, so for any particular wage increase, the supply curve will be upward sloping if the substitution effect dominates the income effect, and it would be downward sloping if the income effect dominated the substitution effect. Okay, so we're going to assume, the textbook says that generally for what we're doing, we're just going to assume that it's upward sloping, and a lot of the empirical evidence says that it's relatively inelastic. Okay, so people, they don't change the amount of hours worked that much in the face of a waging, but you can definitely imagine in principle you could have so for the most part we would think the substitution effect dominate, but we can think of at higher wages that certainly we could see that the income effect would start to dominate, right? If you're making $100 an hour and you get a $20 wage increase, you are able to, you're making a lot of money and you're being able to get a lot of the material things you want in life. And so leisure might start becoming more attractive if you get further increases in your wage. And so at some point in principle, we could see a backward bending labor supply curve. So for most people, most of the population, in the range of the wage for most of the population, it's upward sloping, but we can see at higher wage rates, it's possible that the income effect would dominate the substitution effect. Okay, so now let's put the two curves together. So we have our supply curve. Again, we're just going to think of it as the upward sloping one. And then we have our demand curve, which is the marginal revenue product. And of course, the intersection of the two curves determines the wage in that market and the quantity of hours per period. The reason why we go to the equilibrium is because if the wage were not at that point, we would have a surplus of labor, which would be like unemployment, or we would have a shortage. And those won't tend to persist over a long period of time. There's a tendency, if there's people who are unemployed, there would be a tendency for the wage to fall, right? People need to work and make a living. So, you can imagine that that's going to cause people to want to work. So they would drive the wage down. So people would be willing to work for less after a while of being unemployed. And if there's a shortage of labor, well, then the wage would get bid up by the firms who would need the labor to make the products. This is just an example of an empirical paper that actually estimated the demand and supply curve. So this was for nurses in Minneapolis in the U.S. And as you can see in the real world, things are a little messy, right? So they're not perfectly linear lines. So the demand curve comes down like this and then goes like this. And then the supply curve is generally upward sloping though. But, they're not perfectly straight lines. So in this example, we have that the equilibrium wage was $70,000 and about 34,000 nurses are hired. So, any wage above that you would have an excess supply of labor, and any wage below 70,000, you would have excess demand or shortage. So they must have had a lot of data with variation in salaries and that sort of thing. This would be actually very difficult to measure precisely with data. It's a lot more difficult than it seems. But anyways, that this paper was able to do it. And so this is just, I just thought I'd throw this in as an example. So let's move on to, so if we just think about what the supply curve would look like for an individual firm, well, each individual firm just pays the market wage. And so we would have a perfectly elastic supply curve drawn at the wage. When we do this, all it means is that there's only one wage relevant, right? No matter how much this firm hires, they can always pay the market wage. This is, again, akin to in perfect competition, each individual firm just faced the market price. They could sell as much as they want at the market price. The market price is constant. And so we drew a perfectly elastic demand curve for the firm, for the individual firm. Here it's a similar idea, but this is for the firm's wage. If the firm needed to increase the wage to attract more workers, then the supply curve would be upward sloping. But here it's that's not the case. They're so small they don't affect the overall market, so they can just hire as many people as they want at the wage rate. So this wouldn't be true if you were thinking of a small town and maybe some kind of large firm moved in, like an Amazon distribution center, where they might need a lot of labor, and so they might, because they're so large, start bidding up price of labor. Obviously, they would think about that beforehand. Before moving to a certain city, they would make sure that that wouldn't happen, right? They'd make sure they move somewhere where they're not going to have that much of an impact on the wage, right? But suppose they made a mistake, then, that would be an example that illustrates something different than this. But this, we're just saying they're small, they're not going to impact the overall wage. So we know that marginal revenue product of labor is comprised of marginal product and the price. And so if any of these change, that's going to shift the labor demand curve. If the market price increases, that's going to shift the demand curve to the right. If the marginal product of labor increases, that's going to shift it to the right. And if either of these two decrease, then we get a shift to the left in the demand curve. Okay, let's just do an active learning question. So first of all, what's the marginal product here of the third worker? So it's 6, right? It's going to be 13 minus 7. And so what's then the marginal revenue product of the third worker? So it's going to be 6 times 3. Okay, so it will be $18. Okay, so then if the market wage is $9, how many workers would this firm want to hire to maximize profit? Any workers from 1 to 5 would provide a benefit of the marginal revenue product that exceeds the wage of 9. And then the 6th worker would be exactly equal. So we would just hire up 6. If we were to hire 7, that wouldn't be a good idea because the wage rate is 9, but the benefit of hiring that last worker would only be 6, okay? And 25 units of output would be produced. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're just going to finish up doing some multiple choice questions. Which of the following is a characteristic of the demand for a factor of production such as labor? And so this is something I mentioned right at the beginning. It's a derived demand. Okay, that was at the beginning of the lecture. So this means that the demand for labor is derived from the product market. So whereas if you think of the demand curve for consumers, well, that's not derived. We just, say that abstractly that, that's based on people's preferences and stuff like that. But the demand curve for labor will be derived from that, right? So anyway, so D is not correct because it's certainly not an upward sloping function, right? And C is incorrect because it's not horizontal. We did have a horizontal supply curve in this lecture. That was for the supply of labor because the wage is fixed, okay? And we don't have any vertical demand curve, so that's why A isn't correct. Okay, so let's do this one here. Which of the following best defines the marginal product of labor? Not the marginal revenue product of labor, just the simple marginal product of labor. Okay, go ahead. Okay, all right, so let's go to the next question. If a firm is a price taker in both the labor market and the output market, and that's what we've been doing today, it will, so this should be 100%. So it's going to hire labor. What was the optimization condition? It was where something equaled something, right? So what's the correct answer? You're going to hire labor until the marginal revenue product equals so it's can only be these two. It's equal to the wage. Marginal revenue product equals the wage, right? So if you didn't get that, make sure you review it. Okay, so here we have a question. Let me open your poll. It says, when a firm employs 50 workers, total output's 720. If it hires another one, the output increases to 726. So this one's an easy question. Everyone should get this. What's the marginal product of labor for this output range, which is just hiring this one worker. So when you hire this one worker, what's the marginal product? Okay, 3, 2, 1, and 0. 80% got it right. Good job. So it's 6 units per day. There's one worker hired, they make 6 extra units, so that must be the marginal product, right? Okay, so we have another question here. So we have a situation where we're told the market price, it's $3 of the good, okay? And when we hire this additional worker, it causes output to rise by 10 units. And so here it's asking it says the value of marginal product. That's another way of saying the marginal revenue product. So what's the marginal revenue product of labor for this extra worker? Okay, so we know how much output they are able to make, and we have the price of the product to put the value to it, right? So what's the correct answer here? Oh, I didn't notice that every answer was B. We don't know for sure if it's B for this one, do we? Can you hear me okay? Okay. All right. So the correct answer is 30. So this extra person, this additional person makes 10 units and the price is $3 each. So the answer is 30. Okay. So that's the marginal revenue product. Okay. Here's a little tricky one. Let's see if you can figure this out. So suppose the marginal product of labor equals 1 over L. If the firm can sell its output for $10 per unit and the wage is $1 per unit, how many units of labor will the firm hire? So think about plugging in different values. Okay, so we need to hire labor until the marginal revenue product of labor equals the wage, which is $1. So if you hire one worker, the marginal product of labor is 1, right? And the output is $10 per unit. Okay, so in this case, the marginal revenue product of labor will be $10. That's higher than the wage. So you definitely hire one worker. If you hire 2 workers, you're going to have a marginal product of 1/2. Multiply that by 10, you get $5. So you would still hire. And so you would keep going. So only when you get to labor of 10 would you get 1 divided by 10 times 10 is equal to 1. So when you hire the 10th worker, your marginal revenue product of labor will equal $1, which is equal to the wage. Okay, and so the answer is A. This question here we're told that the market wage is $8. We're given the total product, the total revenue, right? And then it's asking us at the optimum, what would the firm's total revenue be and its total wage payment? So the first thing we want to do here is figure out what the marginal product is, and then we want our marginal revenue product. Okay, so our marginal revenue product of labor is given here. So how did I get this? Well, if you hire the first worker, their marginal product is 4, okay? And the product price, well, we're told total revenue, right? We don't know the product price, but we know that 4 units must give us a revenue of $16. So anyways, here we could use the general formula for the marginal revenue product of labor, which is just the change in total revenue divided by the change in labor. And so here, marginal revenue product is just the difference in these numbers here. So this is your marginal revenue product of labor. So that's your benefit of hiring each unit. And we know the wage is 8. So we would want to keep hiring until the 4th worker inclusive. Okay, and so that would be the optimum. And now at this optimum, we know that the total revenue is 52. Can anyone tell me what the total expenditure on labor would be if we hire 4 workers? Yeah. So we have 4 workers, each of them, we got to pay $8, so it would be 32. And so the answer here is 20 because it's asking for the difference, how much would the revenue exceed the total wage payment? Okay, so in this question, you don't need to do any calculations here. It's not really a trick question, but it's, just as a hint, what's the optimal condition? So the demand and supply curve shown below apply to a competitive market for a factor used in the production of widgets. And it says this factor market is in equilibrium at point B, okay? And so it's asking, when we at this 40th worker, at this point, what's the marginal revenue product of this worker? What would it have to be? The correct answer here is D. The correct answer here is D. So that's because every firm is going to hire until the marginal revenue product of labor is equal to the wage. Every firm's facing the same wage of $8. And so the marginal revenue product of that 40th worker must be 8. Okay? So it's a bit of a trick question. Why is the demand for labor downward sloping? Remember, it's because of an assumption we made. So remember, if it was when the income effect dominated the substitution effect. Okay, so you've been a great class. All the best in your future studies, and take care. Bye for now.